Okay.
Yep, you got it.
Okay, so now you can go back to your slides.
Okay.
Okay. Tonight's meeting concerns the Electoral College, and Michael Ritter, Professor of American Politics at WSU, is here to fill us in on the history and function and other aspects of the Electoral College. Professor Ritter teaches classes and conducts research on voting, elections, election administration, reform politics and policies, and more. His research on voting and elections has appeared in Social Science Quarterly and the Election Law Journal. He is particularly interested in how electoral laws and election administration shape political participation. His most recent book, Accessible Elections: How State Governments Can Help How State Governments Can Help Americans Vote, was published in 2021. So welcome, Professor Ritter, and thank you for coming to enlighten us about this strange thing, the American Electoral College.
Thank you to everyone for having me here today. I'm happy to share information on the Electoral College. So over the course of this talk, of course, before we get to the agenda, I just wanted to provide a picture of the first U.S. president who was also selected by the Electoral College, and also an image of ballot casting, because when we cast ballots, we're actually, as we'll learn in a few moments, when we cast ballots in presidential elections, we're not casting a ballot directly to select the president, we're casting a ballot to select electors, who are people who have been specially selected to basically cast official ballots for presidential candidates, which we'll talk more about in a bit here today. As for the agenda of the talk today, I will examine why the United States has an electoral college, as well as the history of the institution. We'll also explore the question of why does the United States need an electoral college today? And in answering that question, I'll cite various advantages that have been cited linked to the Electoral College. However, I will also cite a number of disadvantages that have been linked to the Electoral College, not only today, but going back even to the earliest days of the United States under the Constitution. We'll also explore several alternatives to the Electoral College and how they can be adopted and implemented in the United States. And I also will provide an overview of the Electoral College in operation from 2008 to 2020. So here's a picture of the Constitution. And why I have a picture of the Constitution here is because the Electoral College is basically substantiated, it is included in the US Constitution, Article 2, specifying how the president is to be selected. Now, the Electoral College is described particularly in Article 2 and specifically in sections 2, 3, and 4, as well as a couple of amendments that were added to the Constitution after the Bill of Rights was adopted in the early 1790s. Now, as I noted earlier, and we'll talk more about who electors are moving forward a bit today, but when you cast a ballot for a president, you're actually casting a ballot for electors, who are specially selected people by state political parties and election authorities who officially cast the deciding ballots in US presidential elections. And each state has a number of electors equal to the number of representatives and senators it sends to Congress. And so if you're the state of, let's say, Wyoming, with 1 representative and 2 senators, you send you have three electoral college votes. If you're a state that has 2 senators and 28 representatives, you have 3 electoral college votes. Now, to be an elector is a temporary position, and that was an intention of those who designed the Electoral College. They thought that by making the position of an elector a temporary position only in place for an election, it would limit the ability of any one elector from being corrupted by other agents in government that might seek to direct their votes in other directions, perhaps against the public will. So that was a very clear intention of the developers of the Electoral College. to minimize what they saw as unjust forms of interference in the U.S. presidential election process. Also, electors cannot be sitting federal government officials. For instance, a member of Congress cannot simultaneously be an elector. That would be seen as a violation of the separation of powers doctrine in U.S. politics, the idea that we have distinct branches of government that have distinct areas of responsibility, and so on. Now, in the present day, to become president, you need to win a majority of the Electoral College votes to be elected president, which presently is at least 270 out of 538 Electoral College votes. I should also note that the vice president is also selected through the Electoral College, and he or she would also need to attain that majority threshold. Currently, a candidate needs to win the most popular votes at the state level to win all of the state's Electoral College votes. And what this basically means, for the most part, U.S. elections are called plurality elections, and in that context, plurality means you simply need to have the most votes. It'd be nice if you had 51% of the vote and you could claim that you had a distinct majority in a state vote. But you could win, let's say, you could win all the Electoral College votes in the state of Washington if you won simply 40% of the vote, and your other two competing candidates only won 30% of the vote. You simply need to have the most. So basically, how it works in most American states is that whichever presidential candidate wins the most popular votes at the state level gets all of that state's Electoral College votes, and those are added together. For a presidential candidate to hopefully get to that 270 target. Now, the exceptions to this are Maine and Nebraska, which both use a method that's called a district allocation method. And this method works in states that have more than one House district, that is generally more populous states. And basically, in district allocation method states, Electoral College votes are awarded by House districts. So if one candidate wins in District 1 in a given state, such as Maine, they get that district's Electoral College vote. And if another candidate wins in the other district, they get that district's Electoral College vote. In Maine and Nebraska, though, if you win the statewide popular vote, you get 2 more state electoral college votes. And those would be the Electoral College votes that represent the 2 senators a state sends to, the 2 senators a state sends to Congress. But the general idea behind the district allocation method is to make Electoral College votes a little more proportional relative to state population. So you may ask yourself, what happens if a majority is not reached in the Electoral College? In such a case, what's called a contingent election will occur, which means that the House Representatives will select the president, choosing from the top 3 electoral finishers, and the Senate will in turn select the vice president out of the top 2 candidates. Now, in these contingent elections, it's not as if 435 members of the House of Representatives cast separate ballots for who should become the president. Each state delegation casts a single vote. Wyoming would cast a single vote, Minnesota would cast a single vote, and so on. And basically, if a candidate gains the support of a majority of states, they become the president or the vice president, because a contingent election, of course, can happen for vice president as well. And for US presidential elections, we haven't had a contingent election in some time. The most recent one was 1824, Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And the first one was 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. There was some talk about the possibility of a contingent election occurring in the 2020 election if a number of states switched from being Democratic Electoral College states to being Republican Electoral College states. If that was if that indeed had happened, the Republican Party actually had an advantage in controlling more state delegations than the Democratic Party. So if it went the contingent election route in the 2020 election, the Republican Party may have had more of an advantage. But as it turned out, of course, the contingent election did not occur because generally speaking, the 2020 election was very, in terms of election administration, it was a very clean election. It was run with surprisingly little election administration issues. And so there's not much evidence to support voter fraud allegations in the 2020 election. So the contingent election strategy was more of a Republican strategy in 2020, but for the aforementioned reasons that did not occur in 2020. So under the US Constitution, electors were initially ordered to cast 2 ballots, and the top vote-getting candidate would become president, and the second place candidate would become the vice president. This changed because of the 1800 election. In the 1800 election, the 2 presidential candidates were Thomas Jefferson, representing the Jeffersonian Republican Party, and John Adams, representing the Federalist Party. In the case of the Electoral College vote in this election, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, the presidential and vice presidential candidate for the same party, ended in an absolute Electoral College tie. And it basically took 36 separate votes in the House before Thomas Jefferson gained enough votes to become the president. And basically, this is why the 12th Amendment was adopted in 1804. And under the 12th Amendment, electors are basically ordered to cast a separate ballot for the president and a separate ballot for a vice presidential candidate to prevent something of the nature of the 1800 election from occurring again. Another relatively more recent innovation or update to the Electoral College and the Constitution is the 23rd Amendment, which guarantees basically American citizens in Washington, D.C., a number of Electoral College votes that is equivalent to the lowest number that can be received by an American state, which is the number 3. So I've given you a general overview of the U.S. Constitutional Electoral College. I'd like to talk about the origins and the thinking during the Constitutional Convention in 1787 about the development of this institution. Surprisingly or unsurprisingly, the Electoral College was not the only consideration or debated point about how the president should be selected at the Constitutional Convention. And, you know, the decision on who should be, I should say the decision or the method on selecting the president wasn't really talked about or resolved until the very end of the Constitutional Convention. Some argue, other scholars argue that, you know, the Constitutional Convention took place during a very hot summer. By the end of the Constitutional Convention, many of the members of the convention may have been tired or eager for the convention to end, and perhaps they made some quick decisions in their constructions of the Electoral College, and maybe did not give it as much thought as other parts of the American government, such as the design of the U.S. Congress. Nevertheless, at the Constitutional Convention, several different methods for selecting a president were considered, including using a national popular vote, selecting the president through state legislators or Congress, selecting electors by congressional districts like Maine and Nebraska do today, and using the Electoral College as we understand it today. Eventually, the compromise position became the Electoral College, and this is for several reasons. One is that it basically balanced the interests of more populous and less populous states. More populous states get a greater Electoral College weight by virtue of the number of representatives they send to Congress. Remember, the number of Electoral College votes a state gets is partly contingent on how many members of the House it sends to Congress. And so more populous states with more members of the House of Representatives have a greater weight in that area of the Electoral College vote. Less populous states, on the other hand, are advantaged by the fact that every state gets 2 senators, and 2 Electoral College votes for every state come from or are linked to those 2 state national state Senate seats. And basically, those 2 Electoral College votes that are linked to a state's national Senate seats basically helps amplify the representational voice of less populous states in U.S. presidential elections, even to the present day. which I'll say a bit more about later today. The Electoral College was also a compromise position between slave states and non-slave states. There's an infamous provision that was in place in the Constitution, basically from the adoption of the Constitution until the end of the Civil War, and that's known as the 3/5 Compromise. The 3/5 Compromise basically held that slaves, African-American slaves, were not counted as full-fledged American citizens. They didn't, of course, receive, many or any substantial degree of rights in the United States. But for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives, a slave would count as 3/5 of a person. And so basically, the 3/5 Compromise kind of inflated slave state representation in the House of Representatives. And because part of the Electoral College vote comes from House of Representative seats, this 3/5 Compromise amplifies the Electoral College representation of Southern slave states in the Electoral College in the pre-Civil War era. And in fact, let's go back to the 1800 election. In the 1800 election, John Adams was running for re-election against his vice president, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, of course, won that election, but if the 3/5 Compromise didn't exist and amplify the number of votes that Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, got from Southern states, John Adams would have prevailed in the Electoral College and likely would have been reelected. And so that compromise position did have lasting implications until the Civil War and gave distinct advantages to presidential candidates that represented Southern interests. A third compromise position was between the desire to elect a president that represented the popular will, while at the same time selecting a president that was best qualified. The founders had distinct fears of what they called demagogues, individuals that would unrightfully use their power for basically individual advantage. And basically, electors were basically intended to be highly enlightened people that would be best vested with the responsibility of balancing the popular interest with the desire of basically selecting the most qualified candidate. So somebody who simultaneously reflected the popular will, as well as had, the qualifications needed to discharge the duties of the presidential office. And I should note, electors, I'll talk about this out of detail shortly here, but when the Constitution was being designed, it was assumed that political parties would not exist. In the present day, and for most American history, electors are selected by political parties, and they're highly likely to basically pledge their Electoral College votes for the presidential candidate that shares their party linkage. During this era, it was more largely assumed that members of the Electoral College would be like enlightened free agents. They would be able to they'd be able to use their elevated election wisdom to basically select a candidate that both reflected the popular will and also had a high degree of qualifications, such as abiding by democratic principles. And so because of the fact that political parties quickly emerged on the scene in American politics in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the Electoral College has never quite worked exactly as it was intended to work because of political parties, but that also is true about a number of other parts of the Constitution. There was also a consensus at the convention that held that the Electoral College protected the independence of the presidency. That is, preserving the presidency as a separate institution of government apart from Congress. And it was thought that selecting the president through Congress or state legislators would make the presidency overly dependent on the legislative branches of government, at either the federal or state level, and that would lead to a weaker executive branch that was not suitable for American politics. Remember, the United States, the U.S. Constitution is the second U.S. Constitution. Under the Articles of Confederation in the 1780s, the United States only had one branch of government, Congress. The United States did not have an executive. The executive is the president. And one of the reasons the Articles of Confederation are critiqued is because of the lack of a powerful presidency. And the presidency is called an executive because he or she has a responsibility to vigorously implement federal laws throughout the states. And basically, going back to this last point in this slide, protecting the separate powers of the presidency was a way for members of the Constitutional Convention basically to promote a vigorous executive branch that could give the federal government more power than it had under the Articles of Confederation, a greater power that was arguably necessary to help the country sustain itself into the 1800s, 1900s, and to the present day. Now, the Electoral College was also seen as a way of protecting federalism. Federalism refers to the balance of power between national and state governments, and the U.S. Constitution protects both national and state governments. Of course, the president is a national institution. Of course, Congress counts the final Electoral College votes, but states decide for themselves what methods they'll use to select Electoral College votes. States also decide who can be electors in their states. So the Electoral College, in those federal and state regards, is seen as a way of balancing federal and state authority in the selection of the president. And a political scientist, Andrew Rudelovich, noted that the Electoral College allowed proponents of popular election and legislative selection both to tout its provisions. That is, the Electoral College, as noted in this previous note, as I noted on the previous slide, the Electoral College balanced, according to the founders, the Electoral College balanced the desires, one, to select a presidential candidate that reflected the popular will, with two, the desire to select a president that represented high qualifications. And I should note with this middle note here, legislative selection meant the role of particularly state legislators and state governments being able to determine how electors would be selected state by state. Now, as I noted in the previous slide, an important consideration to keep in mind is the prevailing sentiment at the Constitutional Convention held that political parties would not exist, and that the Constitution, including the Electoral College component, were designed basically partially based on this prevailing sentiment. And so the intentions of the framers of the Constitution were that the Electoral College would not be interacting with political parties, that it would, it'd be an institution where electors would be able to freely cast their electoral college votes, evenly weighing what is the popular will, while at the same time weighing the desire to select a qualified presidential candidate. With political parties in the equation, political parties have a large influence on how electors are selected and how they cast their ballots. And that has been true basically since the late 1700s, when political parties first arose during the Washington administration and took increased force during the John Adams and Thomas Jefferson administrations. Now, I next want to explore how electors are chosen. And this is an elector from the state of Texas from 2008. Electors can be everyday people like all of us here. They're specially selected again by political parties and state government officials to basically officially cast binding ballots in presidential elections. Here, the electors in the state of Texas in 2008 are taking an oath to pledge their electoral college duty to basically responsibly, in line with constitutional expectations, discharge their electoral college responsibilities. So again, electors are individuals who have been selected by state political parties and government officials to officially cast ballots for presidential candidates. How electors are chosen are determined by state and state political party policies. As I noted previously, members of the Constitutional Convention intended electors to be an assembly of wise and learned leaders that could balance, again, the popular will with the desire to select the most qualified presidential candidates, or candidate, I should say. Now, before the Civil War, the method employed to select electors by state varied considerably. Some states made the decision with state legislators, others by at-large or district by district popular vote elections. Today, what we do in most states, including Washington, is called an at-large election for selecting the Washington state electors. Basically, whoever wins the most votes among the presidential candidates in the state of Washington gets all of Washington's electoral college votes. Going back before the Civil War, some states selected electors partly by legislator and partly by the people, and some from a list of candidates selected by the people, as well as other ways that were employed during this era. So there was more variation in the early to mid 1800s and how states selected electors compared to today. Generally, since the late 1800s, the people have chosen the electors in statewide elections, like we conventionally do today in the state of Washington and 47 other states, as well as the District of Columbia. The two slight exceptions to this are the states of Maine and Nebraska. Again, they generally, again, Maine and Nebraska generally decide on how they award their electoral college votes by state popular vote, but in Maine and Nebraska, it's also a district by district decision as well, with the popular vote winner in different districts getting the electoral college votes from those separate districts. Today, the members of the Electoral College are largely a collection of party loyalists and donors. Remember, political parties have a large role in selecting electors. And so the Republican State Party in Washington and the Democratic Party in the state of Washington, as well as other states, will select different slates of electors. And if a given candidate wins a popular vote, that slate of electors, let's say the Republican Party wins the popular vote in the state of Idaho, the slate of Republican electors in Idaho have pledged their vote for whoever is the Republican candidate, the leading Republican candidate in a given election, such as the 2020 election. And the reason, I should note that state political parties pay a lot of attention in who they're selecting as electors. They want to make sure they're selecting people that are not only very erudite, very smart politically, but they also want to select people that are, very staunch party supporters. There's a consistent pattern in American political science where people that are highly partisan are highly likely to vote in line with their party interests. And so there's a similar analogous line of thinking going on here. By selecting party loyalists and party donors, political parties are enhancing the likelihood that if they win the popular vote in the state, their chosen electors will definitely vote for their for the slate of electors that has been chosen by that political party. I should also note electors can also include state election officials, state party leaders, or people in states that have a personal or political affiliation with their party's presidential candidate. If one is personally interested in who are the electors from one state, each state must send the National Archives a certificate of ascertainment, which lists the names of the electors for the presidential candidates. And in fact, if you go back earlier in American history, it was more typical to vote on presidential ballots where the given electors would actually be listed. That's less conventional today, but it was more common earlier in U.S. history. Now, when do we elect electors? According to the Constitution, Congress determines the dates for selecting electors. Before 1845, electors were selected within 34 days preceding the first Wednesday in December every fourth year. This meant effectively a state could decide when it wanted to select electors sometime within that 34-day timeline. In the early 1800s, it was gradually found that that was not such a good idea because it left opportunities for parties from different states, the same party from different states working together to coordinate campaigning efforts to promote the election of their preferred candidate. So after 1845, a uniform date was set as the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November for when electors are to be selected. Now, according to Article 2 and the 12th Amendment in the Constitution, electors meet in their respective states to vote by ballot for president and vice president. This date is set by Congress, and since 1934, this date has been the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December, which in 2020 was December 14th. Now, so when you cast a ballot for the president early November, that's not the end of the game, as you likely know. The presidential election goes into December and January. So on an appointed day in December, the chosen electors convene in most states at noon. These meetings usually take place in state capitals. And according to the 12th Amendment, as I noted earlier, electors will vote by ballot separately for president and vice president to prevent something like the 1800 election from happening again. Another specification under the 12th Amendment is you must vote for at least one candidate from another state. You can't only vote for home state favorites. That's the logic there. And after balloting separately for president and vice president, the electors send official certificates of the vote and certificates of ascertainment listing their choices by registered mail to the president of the U.S. Senate in D.C. The president of the Senate is the vice president of the United States. So the electoral college votes are then officially counted in Congress. Since 1933, this date for counting electoral college votes has been conventionally set for January 6th, except for years when this date falls on a Sunday. As stipulated in the 12th Amendment, the president of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all the certificates and the votes shall then be counted. That is the separate electoral college votes from the different states. And again, the president of the Senate is the American vice president. Although for the most part, the vice president does not preside over the Senate. The vice president will only be typically in the Senate if there's a need to break a tie-breaking vote, in which case the vice president can vote in the Senate, and in the case of these election matters. Now, Congress does have the power to rule on disputed electoral college votes, and if a majority of both chambers of Congress agree that a state's electoral college votes are questionable, those states' electoral college votes will likely not be counted. And this was a provision first established under the Electoral Count Act of 1887. And Congress, under this law, was permitted to reject those electoral votes not regularly given. Basically, if there was suspicion that voter fraud had tainted electoral college vote results, state electoral college votes could be held in question. Now, under the Electoral Count Act of 1887, only a single representative from the House and the Senate could file an objection to a given vote. And the Electoral Count Act of 1887 was in effect for the 2020 election. And you may recall a number of Republican figures in Congress objecting to the 2020 election results. They did so under the Electoral Count Act of 1887. Now, this law also defers to states and mechanisms states have for resolving such disputes, with state decisions becoming binding on Congress's count of electoral college votes. Basically, if Congress detects a problem in electoral college voting procedures at the state level, Congress will give states an opportunity basically to sort out their electoral college issues. However, the policies by which a state does so have to have been in effect before the election takes place. That is, a state can't invent new rules for reviewing electoral college disputes after the dispute has been filed. This law also led to the creation of what's called a safe harbor provision, which is federal law. Under this provision, if states resolve the electoral college dispute in a timely manner by a given date, then their decisions are binding in the final electoral college vote in Congress. If they're not, though, then they're less likely to be counted in Congress. Again, if no candidate receives 270 electoral college votes, then a contingent election will occur, as we noted earlier. Now, because of the 2020 election experience, Congress passed an updated version of the 1887 law we just covered. This is the Electoral Count Reform and Presidential Transition Improvement Act of 2022. This law clarifies the role of the vice president, clarifies that the role of the vice president is simply to count the ballot. Remember, in the 2020 election, some push was made for Mike Pence not to count certain electoral college votes from states like Wisconsin and so on. And basically, it's kind of interesting. If you read a bit about this, Mike Pence actually phoned and called his fellow Hoosier, Dan Quayle, and asked him, should I engage in this action? Should I dispute these electoral college votes? And Dan Quayle basically said, do not do it. Completely bad idea. Just count the electoral college votes. And that's what Mike Pence did. Basically, the Electoral Count Reform Act that was passed in 2022, it basically clarified that that is basically the vice president's role, just to count the ballots that have been officially determined by state governments. Also, if the electoral college votes from any state are disputed, 1/5 of the members of both the House and the Senate must object in writing with signatures. So remember, under the 1887 Act, it only took one member of the House and the Senate to start an objection. Now it takes 1/5 of members of both the House and Senate to start that objection. Now, let's talk briefly about some advantages and disadvantages of the Electoral College. Some of the justifications we mentioned during the description of the Constitutional Convention, the compromise positions we mentioned. Another advantage that was cited was that electors come directly from the people on a single day for one purpose, that is casting their electoral college votes. And the developers of the Electoral College thought that that was a way to minimize corruption. Also, the Electoral College was held to be consistent with Republican government principles. By Republican government principles, I'm not referring necessarily to the Republican political party, because Republican political principles existed before a Republican political party. Basically, a key, in American politics, we also understand a republic as being another form of democracy, as an indirect democracy where you elect your representatives to represent you. And another key philosophical tenet of an ideally operating Republican government is that it's based on majority rule. That is, popular will be reflected in who is elected to the president. So remember, the Electoral College you can win by having a majority of the Electoral College vote. So the founders of the US Constitution basically argued that majority threshold basically honored a key democratic principle as understood from the angle of Republican political philosophy from that era. The founders also thought that an electoral college would limit the tumult and discord, since electors would make decisions at the same time. They also thought that it would protect against the emergence of factions or political parties that could subvert interest in US elections. And also they thought it would prevent the fragmentation of political parties. And this is actually what some contemporary defenders of the Electoral College will also cite. They note that the Electoral College promotes a two major party system, and that if we were to move to a national popular vote system, that may result in more than two major parties that could arguably lead to more inconsistencies in US politics. As for disadvantages of the Electoral College, some cite the fact that it has overrepresentation of less populous states. This is known as the malapportionment in the Electoral College. For instance, the average voting power for a voter in Wyoming is far greater than that of a person in the state of Wyoming. For instance, divide the number, there's 3 Electoral College votes in Wyoming, but there's only a few 100,000 eligible voters. And so basically, each individual voter has a lot more impact on a single Electoral College vote and how it's cast in Wyoming than a single eligible voter in Washington, where there's several million eligible voters. And so the critique here is that there's more representational power given to individuals from less populous states to select presidents than individuals from more populous states. Another critique is that presidential campaigns focus more attention on battleground states, states that are closely in contention. There's close competition between political parties, and basically presidential candidates will ignore the rest. Also, another critique is third and minor parties are disadvantaged for the aforementioned reasons. The Electoral College is a key way to maintain the two-party system. Also, as we noted at the beginning of this talk, there are times when the national popular vote doesn't match the Electoral College result. And in those instances, you can critique the Electoral College. It's not perfectly, you can critique the Electoral College. It's not properly reflecting the public will and the public desire for a presidential candidate. I also want to note another disadvantage is that not every American citizen is represented by the Electoral College. Only Americans in states or DC can cast votes that can influence Electoral College decisions. American citizens in Wyoming, numbering in millions, don't have such an ability because Puerto Rico is not a US state at this time. There's also the critique that's known as the wasted vote theory. And this is the, for political scientists who study voting, they tend to notice a pattern. If you, let's say, are a Republican in California, it's probably highly likely in 2020 or 2024 that the California vote is going to go to the Democratic candidate. And so you may think that your vote will be wasted, your efforts are going to be wasted, and so that's going to deter you from voting. And you could say the same thing for a Democratic voter in a state that usually heavily goes to the Republican Party candidate. And so this critique is that the Electoral College disincentivizes people from voting that feel like they're not being represented by their state voting results. And I just briefly want to talk about elections where we had disparities between Electoral College and popular vote. These were 1824, 1876, and 1888. And as we noted more recently, the 2000 and 2016 elections. Of course, we think of Bush versus Gore, perhaps, when we think of these elections. Lastly, I want to talk about alternatives to the Electoral College. Arguments in favor of the Electoral College usually reference one or more of the advantages cited earlier. However, there are several reform measures that have been proposed, adopted, and implemented. And some of these reforms can take place within the existing constitutional framework without necessitating an amendment. For one, some have suggested that more states should follow the Maine and Nebraska district allocation method for selecting electors, as I noted earlier. Under such a system, electors are won district by district, with 2 electors also awarded for winning the statewide vote. This is arguably a more proportional way of allocating Electoral College votes. Imagine you're in California. California is an all-blue state in presidential elections in recent years, but there's counties, there's districts in California that are more Republican, more red, so to speak. And so if California moved to a district, district allocation method system, there'd be increased potential for Republican voters in the state of California to select Republican electors that would have a distinct impact in a presidential election. And again, you can make the same point about Democratic strongholds and Democratic strongholds in states that usually go a Republican direction. Other measures that would not require a constitutional amendment include the following. One is the elimination of faithless electors. A faithless elector is an elector who doesn't vote in line with their party's leading candidate in a presidential election. The assumption here is that, let's say when a Republican voter votes for the Republican president, they want the chosen Republican electors to choose the Republican candidate. That could be Romney in 2012 or Trump in 2020. A faithless elector may decide instead to vote for John McCain or another Republican candidate that's not Donald Trump. And basically, faithless electors are seen as being undermining of the popular will. If you cast a ballot for the Democratic major party candidate, you theoretically would like to see that candidate get the Electoral College vote you voted for. You wouldn't like to see that elector vote against your interests. And so the argument here is that eliminating faithless electors will allow the popular will to more carry forth in American elections. Also, there's a reform proposal, or there's calls for basically eliminating the unit rule in the House and Senate contingent elections. Instead, if there was a contingent election, the idea is that every member of the House and every member of the Senate would be able to vote for presidents and vice presidents. Another option is to move to the national popular vote option through what's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And the constitutionality of this proposal, the National Popular Vote Interstate compact is based on the ability of states to decide how they select electors. And this is an agreement among a group of states and DC to award all their electoral college votes to whichever presidential candidate wins the overall popular vote in the 50 states in DC. The compact agreement would go into effect only when the total electoral college vote in the compact states would guarantee the election, meaning that a number of states in DC have agreed to it that equals 270 electoral college votes. And currently, 15 states in DC have agreed to this compact, representing 195 electoral college votes. And by that benchmark, this proposal is 72% of the way of becoming a way of selecting the president. Now, this would not require a constitutional amendment. And basically, this is a map that just gives you an idea of what states have enacted the interstate popular vote compact I mentioned on the previous slide, what states are still considering it. Green states have adopted, yellow states have considered. And as you can see, if the pending states were to adopt this plan, basically the country would move to a national popular vote plan. And I should note that the states are differentially sized on this map, depending on how many electoral college votes they contribute to presidential elections. So formally replacing the electoral college in the Constitution, let's say formally replacing it with the national popular vote provision would require a constitutional amendment, which requires support from 2/3 of both chambers of Congress plus 3/4 of the state. I do want to add, though, that whether through an amendment or the interstate compact, a national popular vote has always been a consideration in the United States, even during the Constitutional Convention era. And I just want to show you a few closing slides before we move on. I just want to give you some public opinion measures on how popular the national popular vote idea has been. These are figures from Gallup from 1967, 1980, 2000. As you can see, in the 60s and 80s, the idea for a national popular vote had fairly moderately sizable bipartisan support. In the 2000 election, independents and Democrats continued to be highly praiseworthy of the national popular vote idea, but Republicans became more solid on that idea, likely because they saw how the Electoral College advantaged the likelihood of Bush being elected. And we kind of see kind of a mere reflection of this in the 2020 election results, and how different individuals, depending on party, view the national popular vote. This is a graph based on Pew survey data. Basically, the percentage of people who think that the country should move to a popular vote system. And as you can see, Democrats are consistently more supportive. Republicans are less so, but particularly, I would say, during elections where the Electoral College clearly helped a Republican candidate win an election. Republicans were much more supportive of moving towards the national popular vote during the middle of the Obama administration. And we see a similar breakdown here. Very conservative Republicans and very conservative Republicans are the only group that's not supportive of a move to the national popular vote. All other groups defined by age, Democrats, etc., tend to be in favor of a national popular vote. I want to show you just a couple closing maps. This is the Electoral College map from 2020, showing you which states, red states indicate went to Trump, blue states went to Biden. If it's a darker blue, that means the state was more strongly decided in a Democratic direction. Darker red means more starkly in a Republican direction. You'll notice that Maine and Nebraska have little circles inside their boundaries. That's to indicate how districts went different directions in their electoral college vote results. This is a map that shows you the variation within states. So if every state moved to a district by district selection mechanism, likely this variation would be more captured in electoral college vote results. I constructed a few maps measuring what states presidential candidates visited from 2008 to 2020. And generally all the maps show something similar. And basically what the similarity is that presidential candidates only tend to go to battleground states where both parties have kind of an equal chance of impacting the election results and winning that state's electoral college votes. If a state is a safe bet, like Washington or California or Alabama or Mississippi or New York, it's less likely that presidential candidates are going to use their campaign resources to get electoral college votes in those areas. I also want to briefly note that I did some analyses on these numbers, and I did find that presidential candidates are more likely, campaign visits are more likely to occur when a state is more politically competitive, has a higher population of eligible voters, is a battleground state, and when it has a higher number of electoral college votes. And I should note, these are our battleground states in 2020, Florida, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and so on. And also, I find that voter turnout tends to be higher when there are more campaign visits, when political competition is higher, when a state is battleground state, and when a state has more electoral college votes. I also did some more in-depth analyses, and my in-depth analyses suggest that the electoral college vote can have an effect on voter turnout through its ability to shape how and where presidential candidates campaign. And so in that regard, the electoral college could lead to inequalities in voter turnout by differentially incentivizing presidential candidates only to travel to certain states rather than others. Thank you for your time today. That brings me to a close of my summary on the electoral college. Are there any questions for me?
There.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of information. Really interesting.
Thank you. Sorry for going a little over.
No, it's not a
That's
problem.
no problem.
See if I can.
I think you covered all the questions that I had.
Yeah.
Was that someone with a question?
That's me, Lennis.
Hi, Lennis.
This is just a question. Do you think that in your lifetime you will see a change to the electoral college?
I think I'm moderately optimistic. As we can see here, as I noted, a move to a national popular vote, for instance, has been a subject of national discourse since basically the era of the Constitutional Convention. And in fact, changes from the Electoral College to the national popular vote have been proposed as serious constitutional features going back to the early 1800s. And as we can see, there generally is pretty high public support late 20th century, early 21st century for move to a national popular vote. So I do think the popular will is there. The constraints on moving towards, let's say, national popular vote, I think are party politics and the fact that a major change such as this, if you go the amendment route, it would have to go through both the House and the Senate with a supermajority vote and a supermajority 3/4 of states also approving. I also think that the amendment route may be more difficult. I do think that, let me go back to the interstate compact plan is, I think, a distinct possibility. The proponents of the interstate compact plan note that it has constitutional merit because it doesn't subvert the established electoral system. It works within the existing electoral college framework. It's a way of accomplishing a national popular vote development without passing a new amendment. And so I do think in my lifetime reforms to the electoral college are possible. One could be this, others could be more states move towards a Nebraska or Maine system. But I definitely think there's interest. And I think, there's a consistent finding in political science research that if a person perceives that a voting rule advantaged or disadvantaged their party's candidate, they're highly likely to be more supportive of that rule if it is perceived as having advantaged their candidate, and to opposing that rule if it disadvantaged their disadvantage their candidate. And I think if Republican candidates in the future are disadvantaged by the Electoral College, I think Republican support could go up for moving towards the national popular vote. Kind of in line with the support numbers you saw from the 1960s and 1980s.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Hi there, Deborah.
Hey, I was wondering, essentially what I got from this is the Electoral College is eliminating any possibility of a third party ever emerging in this country. There's been a few times when we've gotten pretty close with a third party. What has happened in those instances?
In those instances, which has happened a few times in US history, third parties simply haven't gotten over the threshold where they can basically command the terrain, so to speak. Scholars have pointed, I should note the Electoral College doesn't guarantee a two-party system, but it makes it more likely and it makes its continuation more likely. One possibility that could make a third party more impactful in a presidential election is if, let's suppose that we have the two major parties, the Republican and Democratic parties, they get a sizable number of Electoral College votes, but neither party gets to 270. And then there's a third party that has won like 40 or 50 electoral or 60 Electoral College votes. And basically, whoever they give those Electoral College votes to can help, if they decide to give the Electoral College votes to the Republican Party wins the presidential election, or the Democratic Party wins the presidential election. Basically, if that happens, if a third party candidate wins more Electoral College votes, they have more of an ability to bargain with the major parties and get the major parties to be more supportive of what the third parties are trying to do in politics. And so the Electoral College does make the two-party system more likely. It doesn't guarantee it. And third parties have historically at times won sizable numbers of Electoral College votes, and it can potentially be a bargaining chip for those third parties.
What I've seen in my lifetime is that when somebody does try a third party, it just splits whichever party they're close to, and so that the other party wins.
Yeah. There's these two concepts political scientists talk about. It's kind of related to the wasted vote theory I noted earlier. You have your sincere preferences as a voter, and you have your strategic preferences. If you vote based on your sincere preferences, you're going to vote for the candidate that's closest to your preferences, which may be a third party candidate. But because of the two-party system in the United States, a lot of voters will vote strategically. They're going to vote for the major party candidate. They may not be their best sincere vote choice, but it's the best strategic choice because it's the major party candidate that's closest to their preferences and is most likely to win. So yeah.
Segue into ranked choice voting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I've been, noticing that the two major parties, the extreme ends of them are gaining footage or whatever as policymakers, and the center is sort of left, you're waffling. So I don't know.
Yeah. I remember one of the intentions of the Electoral College, according to the Constitutional Convention, was to prevent tumult or prevent instability or polarization in the United States. But remember, I also noted that the Electoral College was designed with the assumption that political parties went to exist. And so, as you can see in the 2020 election, political parties can behave in different ways in interaction with the Electoral College, and in ways that some may perceive as not democratic or not constitutional. By democratic, I mean like American democracy.
Yeah.
Well, we're we've gone over a little bit. Are there any last quick questions? No, he's gonna go 40, 20. Well, thanks again for coming, Michael. This
Well,
has
thank you
been,
for having me.
it's been just really, really interesting and enlightening and thought-provoking.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Explained a lot of stuff that went on with this last election that I didn't really understand.
Well, thank you for having me. It was my pleasure. I loved
Right.
talking to you all and sharing
Yes, it
sharing
was
about the
Thank-
Electoral College.
very informative. Thanks a
Thank you
lot.
so much.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye,
that's
everyone.
all for tonight.
Thanks, Paul and Susan.
Thank you.
Okay.